Hello and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Professor G. I'm a law professor and a historian, and my area of scholarly research and focus is on the slave laws and slave codes that sustained and maintained the slaveocracy that was the antebellum South that eventually became the Confederate States of America. And as I'm making this video, it is Juneteenth. And in honor of Juneteenth, last night I finally had the opportunity to sit and watch half of the film. I didn't get to finish it yet, but the Will Smith film Emancipation. And what I like to do on this channel a lot is I like to look at how slavery is portrayed in the media and come to you and explain whether or not it is historically accurate on, here on YouTube. And I do that because many of these films are very historically accurate and they are incredibly violent. And many Confederate sympathizers and people who want to try and, tone down slavery or say it wasn't that bad look at these films and say, oh, this is Hollywood being dramatic, this is an over-dramatization of it, this isn't actually what happened. So I like to look and make these videos to explain to you that no, it is a very historically accurate view of what slavery was like for the enslaved during the antebellum period all the way up through the Civil War till the passage of the 13th Amendment. And I think that's very important because, again, especially today in 2025, with revisionist historians coming out trying to glorify the Confederacy and Confederate leaders, it's important for us to really understand that the South, the Confederacy, and the antebellum slaveholding states was not a society with slaves. It was, in fact, a slave society. Everything about it was built and focused around the institution of African slavery. And while, yes, this is commonly a common thread on this channel that you see commented a lot by, again, Confederate sympathizers, not every white person owned slaves in the antebellum South. Every white person was heavily invested in the system of African slavery and did everything they could to promote and sustain it. And you can watch previous videos of mine that explain this. But for example, when we talk about films, one film that I've talked about in previous video was Django Unchained, and how at the very end of that film, Dr. King Schultz, if you remember the German character in the film, bought and then freed Broomhilda by signing a paper, and they called it her Freedom Papers. And I explained that in Mississippi during that time, that couldn't happen. That wasn't allowed. There was no just pencil whipping and emancipation. The state, in fact, all the slaveholding states, were heavily against slave owners freeing their enslaved. And you can go back and watch that video, and I plan on making another one sometime in the next couple of days about manumission and emancipation in the slaveholding states. But I want to put, and I'll put a link in the description because I can't splice videos here on YouTube yet. But again, if you want to see higher quality videos, remember to like, subscribe, share, so I can get, better things here and grow this channel, of course. But I'll put a link in the description to the first scene of the movie Emancipation. And in that scene, Will Smith's character is being requisitioned by the Confederate Army. And this did happen. So the reason that I'm only focusing on the beginning of the film and what happens in the scene is because when slaves were requisitioned by the Confederate Army, they fell under a whole different set of rules and laws and things that were going on under the military system as opposed to the civil law and the law of the state, in this case of Louisiana, that came to governing slaves and what slaveholders and their agents, such as masters, such as overseers and drivers, could do. So I only want to focus on that. And also, as the film progressed, it takes place right when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, so in 1863, and that's the premise of the film. And again, I haven't finished it yet, so don't spoil it for me. But based on a true story, Will Smith's character learns of the Emancipation Proclamation and tries to run to Union lines. But then as slavery and when the Civil War began, you no longer really have, for the most part, there are some, like in Alabama, I've discovered some in some papers I've written, there are continued lawsuits and criminal issues dealing with slaves, but as the Confederacy was falling apart, as the war was becoming more devastating, and people were starving, and lots of other things were going on, it is safe to say that people got away with a lot of things they wouldn't have got away in a peacetime slaveocracy. So I don't want to focus on that part of the film, just this very beginning, because I think it's important. Well, if you watch this clip, the owner, and again, these are horrible terms to say, but we're using the historically accurate terms. The owner of Will Smith is, of course, angry because his slaves are being requisitioned by the Confederate Army, and when his overseers go in to grab Will Smith's character, Will Smith confronts them. He bows up to them. He says, I'll walk. I can do it myself. Long story short, as you can imagine, the overseers didn't like this. A scuffle ensues, and at some point, they fall on the ground. Three of them are fighting him. He bites one of them, and the fight is only stopped when one of the overseers points a pistol at Will Smith's character's wife, and that gets them to stop. Now, if he would have shot her, and this is one of those things where I could tell you clearly, if you look at the slave laws and slave codes of antebellum slaveholding Louisiana, if you would have just shot her and other white men in that area would have testified against that overseer, that would have been a crime, right? There were lines that were drawn. This doesn't make it good at all. Go watch my previous videos where I explain that most of these lines and these laws were paper tigers. But again, I'm trying to be and show you the historical accuracy of this. Now, simply threatening her to get Will Smith's character under control would have been perfectly acceptable because nothing happened. But that's not what I want to focus on. What then happens is Will Smith turns his back to go walk to the wagon to be taken to the Confederate Army as a slave for them, and one of the overseers comes up behind him and just pistol whips him in the back of the head, knocking him on the ground. Now, at this point, Will Smith had given up. He was no longer fighting back, and this seems clearly just like, in civil law, a battery. The overseer just came up and clocked him on the back of the head, which would cause serious injury. It knocked him out, it knocked him on the ground. And a lot of people would say, well, this is just Hollywood adding gratuitous violence to a slave scene. No one would have done that. I told you, and this is not hyperbole. I literally have an individual I know who, when I was saying that one of my papers this year was published on the Louisiana Civil Code and slavery, he objected to violence against slaves, saying, I wouldn't beat my tractor. And I had to explain to him that a tractor, a non-conscious being, would react very differently to your commands than a human being. And that enslavers did use violence to coerce and to force the enslaved to do certain things and to toe the line and to be good slaves. So there is no analogy there. And that's why this is important. Because, yeah, you would argue that no enslaver would have just hit their slave on the back of the head, because that would have caused irreparable damage, made him unable to work, and it would have just damaged the master's property. However, that's not the case, because it set an example. And now I want to show you why in Louisiana, if, let's say, someone sued this overseer, if the master sued this overseer and said, you destroyed my property by hitting him in the back of the head with a pistol, what a court would say. The Louisiana Supreme Court would have agreed that that overseer was in his right for no other reason except to make a scene to pistol whip Will Smith's character in the back of the head. So I want to look at a case, Martineau v. Hooper, and this was in 1820, so early Louisiana. So this sets the scene, right? Now, in this case, we had a killing of a slave by an overseer. And as the story goes, the overseer had a problem with this enslaved individual. His name was Harry, and the overseer believed him to be ungovernable. There was nothing that he could do to make Harry toe the line as a good enslaved person. Well, one day Harry was upsetting this overseer, and when you read this and you read through the lines, many times you understand the poor enslaved individual probably wasn't doing anything wrong, right? Or was probably having human emotion and reaction to whatever this overseer was commanding him to do. Well, long story short, the overseer orders that Harry be tied to a tree and whipped for his insolence, right? Harry refuses. Harry then ends up grabbing a hoe, like a garden tool, right? And the overseer also grabs one, and they begin to fight. And as they begin to fight, the overseer then makes a break for the house, where he had already set a shotgun. He actually left a shotgun loaded, and I believe it was a shotgun. It's a gun, but I don't want to have any, you're wrong, right? Go Westlaw this if you want. I've written about this case multiple times, but I can't remember if it was a shotgun or just a regular gun. Long story short, he left a gun there just in case. Well, Harry realizes this, and they race to the house to see who can get to the gun first, because Harry knows he's going to die if this overseer gets the gun. Overseer beats Harry there, unfortunately, gets the gun, and shoots Harry dead. So Harry's owner, again, horrible to say, the enslaver of Harry, sues the overseer for the destruction of his property. And also the issue of whether or not this is criminal. So we have civil liability, we have criminal liability. But again, you're going to see that none of this matters. Um, the master sues him. It goes to court, ends up going all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court held that in this case, the overseer was not liable because the killing of Harry served the interest of the slave owner, right? And the broader community as a whole, because a slave who set such a bad example could not go unpunished. So the owner sued sued the overseer. Harry was the slave, forgive me. The owner sued the overseer, said, "You destroyed my property." The court said, "No, master, no enslaver. What your overseer did by killing Harry actually benefited you and benefited the wider enslaving community, because all the other slaves who saw this now learned a very valuable lesson. Don't confront and don't try and stand up to your master, your overseer. You are a slave. You owe absolute obedience and submission to that individual, or an extension of him, one of his agents, such as an overseer." So do you see how ridiculous this is? Right? The overseer could kill Harry, the enslaved man, because he didn't want to be tied up and whipped, shoot him dead, and then the court said that the overseer wasn't liable to the plaintiff, to the enslaver, the person who owned Harry, by saying that this actually benefited the enslaver and benefited the community because it set an example. If a slave is going to act like this, then a slave can be killed. And that's just the way it is. And this is what you see in the beginning of the film Emancipation, where the conflict seeming to have been over, Will Smith's character was doing what he was told, and an overseer just comes up behind him and pistol whips him in the back of the head and knocks him to the ground. Seeming to be gratuitous, excessive violence, but that is exactly what would have been expected and condoned in the slaveocracy that was Louisiana in the antebellum South. So that part of this film, this violence that many apologists for the Confederacy like to say is just Hollywood. They wouldn't beat their tractor. Well, yeah, they would, and they did many, 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 many times. Not only beaten, but maimed and killed, and the courts condoned it and said it was in the better interest of the slave-owning community as a whole in order to keep the enslaved in line. So, I mean, this is just another example of the horrors of the antebellum slaveocracy and the system that was slavery in the antebellum South. So again, if you watch these films, many of them, the violence seems over the top and excessive, but a lot of that is 100% accurate. And this is just an example. So watch these movies, like I tell my children, when you watch these movies, you're really looking into a historical, telescope here. You're looking into a historical viewfinder to see what it was actually like for many of these poor enslaved people. And you also see that, and I'll talk about this in a future video, one of the next ones I intend to make, that because the system of African slavery in the United States was 100% based on race, unlike other forms of slavery in the past, that this racism, this bigotry, this belief in white supremacy that existed, that allowed people like masters and overseers to do and not feel bad about insane, cruel punishments towards these people, that racist viewpoint didn't die with the 13th Amendment. It continued and exists as systemic racism that is built within the system, because this nation was founded with the Constitution even allowing and talking about one specific species of property in African people, property in man. So slavery was one of the foundational elements of the United States, and that, as you see through the antebellum South and through these laws and codes and all of that, go watch a video I made about the Somerset decision, where many Southern jurists believe you didn't need a positive law to have slavery because slavery was the natural condition of people of the African race. So therefore, it was just natural. Well, that racist idea didn't die with the 13th Amendment. And that's why studying this and understanding the horrors of it is so very important. So again, just my analysis of the first few minutes of the movie Emancipation. The link to the clip of that first scene is in the description box. Remember, like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next video.